The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace shimmered under the light of crystal chandeliers as hundreds of distinguished guests gathered for the annual Commonwealth reception. Camilla, dressed in an elegant navy gown adorned with the Queen Mother's sapphire brooch, moved through the crowd with practiced grace. She smiled warmly at ambassadors and dignitaries, her every gesture carefully measured and regal. But beneath the polished exterior, she carried a secret that had been buried for decades. William stood near the ornate fireplace, engaged in conversation with the Canadian High Commissioner. His tall frame commanded attention, and his easy smile put everyone at ease. He had grown into his role as heir apparent with remarkable dignity, balancing duty with genuine warmth. As he scanned the room, his eyes briefly met Camilla's, and she offered him a small nod of acknowledgement. Neither of them knew that within hours, their relationship would be forever changed. The evening progressed smoothly until Lady Margaret Thornbury arrived. The elderly aristocrat, now in her 80s, had known the royal family for decades. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her memory remained crystal clear despite her advanced age. As she entered the ballroom, leaning slightly on her walking stick, several guests turned to greet her. Lady Margaret had been away from London for years, living quietly in her Scottish estate. But tonight she had returned for a very specific purpose. Camilla noticed Lady Margaret's arrival and felt an unexpected chill run down her spine. They had met many years ago, long before Camilla's marriage into the royal family. Lady Margaret had been present at certain gatherings, had overheard certain conversations, and had kept certain documents that everyone assumed had been destroyed. The two women's eyes met across the crowded room, and in that moment, Camilla knew that her carefully constructed world was about to crumble. Lady Margaret made her way slowly through the crowd, stopping to exchange pleasantries with old friends. But her destination was clear. She was moving steadily toward the center of the room where Camilla stood with a group of Commonwealth representatives. William, still engaged in his own conversations, hadn't noticed the subtle tension that was building. Other guests continued their discussions, unaware that a drama decades in the making was about to unfold. As Lady Margaret approached, Camilla excused herself from her current conversation and moved to intercept the older woman. They met near a quiet alcove, partially hidden by a massive floral arrangement. Lady Margaret's voice was low but clear as she spoke. "My dear Camilla, it's been far too long. I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." Camilla's carefully maintained composure began to crack. She knew exactly what Lady Margaret meant, and she knew there was no escape. The secret that Camilla had guarded so carefully involved events from the early 1980s, a time when she was navigating the complex world of British high society. There had been documents signed, promises made, and arrangements that were meant to remain forever hidden. Lady Margaret had been a witness to these dealings, and more importantly, she had kept copies of papers that proved Camilla's involvement in matters that would shock even the most seasoned royal observers. William, having finished his conversation, began to move through the room, greeting other guests. He noticed Camilla and Lady Margaret in deep discussion and felt a moment of curiosity. Lady Margaret was known for her discretion, so the intensity of their conversation seemed unusual. As he drew closer, he could see the tension in Camilla's shoulders and the determined set of Lady Margaret's jaw. Something was clearly amiss. Before William could reach them, Lady Margaret raised her voice slightly, just enough for nearby guests to hear. "I think it's time the truth came out. Don't you? After all these years of deception, doesn't young William deserve to know about the financial arrangements? About the trust fund that was supposed to be his?" The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Conversations around them stuttered to a halt as guests turned to stare. Camilla's face had gone pale. She reached out as if to touch Lady Margaret's arm, to quiet her, but the older woman stepped back. "No, my dear. I've kept your secret long enough. The boy has a right to know about his mother's legacy and what you did to ensure it never reached him." The ballroom, which moments before had buzzed with conversation, fell into an uncomfortable silence. All eyes turned to William, who stood frozen, his expression a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. The truth that Lady Margaret began to reveal was more complex than anyone could have imagined. In the months following Diana's death, there had been a substantial trust fund established by Diana's personal estate, separate from the official royal arrangements. This fund, worth millions, was intended to provide William and Harry with independent financial security, free from royal control. But through a series of legal maneuvers and with the help of certain officials who owed her favors, Camilla had managed to redirect these funds. The money hadn't been stolen in the traditional sense. Instead, it had been channeled into various charitable organizations and private investments, all controlled by a complex web of trusts and shell companies that ultimately benefited Camilla's own family members and close associates. The documentation had been so cleverly disguised that even forensic accountants would have struggled to uncover the trail. But Lady Margaret had the original papers, the ones that clearly showed Camilla's signature and her explicit instructions. As Lady Margaret continued to speak, producing document after document from her elegant handbag, the atmosphere in the ballroom grew increasingly tense. Security personnel moved closer, unsure whether to intervene. Senior royal aides exchanged worried glances, already calculating the public relations disaster that would follow. But no one dared to stop Lady Margaret. Her reputation and connections made her untouchable, and, besides, the cat was already out of the bag. William's reaction was not what anyone expected. Rather than the explosion of anger that many anticipated, he became very still, his face a mask of controlled emotion. He had been trained from birth to maintain composure in any situation, and that training served him now. But those who knew him well could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. His jaw tightened, and his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an edge of steel that made everyone lean in to hear. "Lady Margaret," he said, his words carefully measured, "I think perhaps we should continue this conversation in private." But Lady Margaret shook her head. "No, Your Highness. This deception has been private for too long. Your mother wanted you to have independence, to have choices. That was stolen from you, and everyone here should know it." She turned to address the wider crowd, her voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. This woman, she gestured toward Camilla, betrayed not just Diana's memory, but her own stepson's futures. The revelations continued to pour out. Lady Margaret explained how Camilla had used her influence to have certain lawyers dismissed, how she had arranged for key documents to be lost in bureaucratic shuffles, and how she had convinced Charles that the trust fund issue was merely a misunderstanding that had been resolved. The scope of the deception was breathtaking, involving dozens of people over many years, all carefully orchestrated to ensure that William and Harry never learned about their mother's final gift to them. Camilla finally found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. "This is all a misunderstanding," she began, but her words rang hollow even to her own ears. The evidence was too overwhelming, the documentation too clear. She looked to William, hoping to find some trace of the warm relationship they had built over the years, but his face remained impassive. The stepson who had come to accept her, who had included her in family moments, now looked at her as if she were a stranger. The reaction from the other guests ranged from shock to barely concealed satisfaction. Some had always harbored doubts about Camilla's role in the royal family, and this seemed to confirm their worst suspicions. Others, who had been genuine supporters, felt a sense of betrayal. The international dignitaries present knew they were witnessing a moment that would make headlines around the world, and many were already mentally composing the reports they would send back to their governments. William took a step forward, and the crowd parted before him. He walked slowly toward Camilla, each step measured and deliberate. When he stood before her, he spoke in a voice that only she and those closest could hear. "Is it true?" he asked simply. The question hung between them, heavy with years of carefully built trust that was now crumbling. Camilla's eyes filled with tears, but she couldn't bring herself to deny it. Her silence was answer enough. What happened next stunned everyone, including Lady Margaret. William turned away from Camilla and addressed the room at large. His voice was calm, controlled, but carried an undertone of profound disappointment. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption to what should have been a pleasant evening. I ask that you all respect the privacy of my family as we address these revelations. The reception will continue, but I must ask you to excuse me." With that, he walked toward the exit, his bearing still regal despite the personal blow he had just received. But before he reached the doors, William stopped and turned back. His eyes found Camilla, who stood isolated in the center of a circle of shocked guests. "My mother," he said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. Deserved better. My brother and I deserved better. And you." He paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "You have betrayed not just our trust, but the memory of a woman who can no longer defend herself." The doors opened, and William walked out, leaving behind a ballroom in chaos. The immediate aftermath was pandemonium. Royal aides scrambled to control the situation, ushering guests toward the exits while trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. Photographers who had been documenting the reception suddenly found their equipment confiscated, though everyone knew it was too late. Too many people had witnessed the confrontation, and in the age of social media, the news would spread within minutes. Camilla remained where she was, seemingly unable to move, as the ballroom emptied around her. Lady Margaret, her mission accomplished, allowed herself to be escorted to a private room where senior palace officials waited to debrief her. She had more documents, she informed them calmly, and was prepared to turn everything over to the proper authorities. Her lawyers were already preparing a comprehensive file that would be delivered to William's legal team. She had waited years for this moment, she explained, wrestling with her conscience about whether to reveal what she knew. But ultimately, she decided that the truth had to come out. In the days that followed, the palace machinery went into overdrive trying to manage the crisis. Statements were prepared and discarded, legal teams were consulted, and crisis management experts were brought in, but the damage was done. The story had spread beyond Britain, making headlines in every major newspaper and dominating news cycles around the world. The carefully cultivated image of royal unity and harmony had been shattered in the most public way possible. William's response to the crisis demonstrated the kind of king he would one day become. He refused to engage in public mudslinging or allow the situation to descend into a media circus. Instead, he issued a single, dignified statement acknowledging that serious allegations had been made and that they would be investigated thoroughly through proper legal channels. He asked for privacy for his family, particularly for his children, who should not suffer for the actions of adults. His measured response earned him widespread respect. Behind palace walls, however, the situation was far more complex. Charles found himself caught between his wife and his son, torn between loyalty and truth. The evidence Lady Margaret had provided was incontrovertible, and forensic accountants confirmed that millions of pounds that should have gone to William and Harry had indeed been diverted. The legal implications were staggering, and there were questions about whether criminal charges might be brought. The monarchy itself seemed to teeter on the edge of a constitutional crisis. Harry, contacted at his home in California, initially refused to believe the allegations, but as more evidence emerged, his anger exceeded even William's. He had always been more volatile, less constrained by royal protocol, and his public statements were fierce in their condemnation. The brothers, who had already been dealing with strained relations, found common ground in their outrage over this betrayal. For the first time in years, they presented a united front, demanding full accountability and transparency. Camilla's position became increasingly untenable. Calls for her to renounce her title grew louder, both from within the palace and from the public. Her own family members distanced themselves, not wanting to be tainted by association. The charities she patronized quietly suggested she step back from her roles. The woman who had worked so hard to be accepted, who had finally seemed to find her place within the royal family, now found herself more isolated than ever before. The investigation that followed was thorough and unsparing. Every financial transaction was scrutinized, every document examined. What emerged was a pattern of manipulation that shocked even seasoned observers of royal affairs. It wasn't just about the money, investigators realized. It was about control, about ensuring that Diana's sons would always be dependent on the institution, rather than having the freedom their mother had wanted for them. The psychological impact of this betrayal was perhaps even greater than the financial one. William's public composure during this period was remarkable. He continued with his royal duties, smiling for cameras and fulfilling his obligations. But those close to him noticed changes. There was a new hardness in his eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. He had always been cautious about trust, but this betrayal by someone he had come to accept as family had reinforced his instinct to keep people at a distance. Only with his wife and children did he allow his guard to drop. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and drawn out. Camilla's lawyers argued that she had acted within the law, that the financial arrangements, while perhaps ethically questionable, were technically legal, but public opinion had already rendered its verdict. The court of public opinion can be harsher than any legal court, and Camilla found herself condemned not just for what she had done, but for the years of deception that followed. Every smile, every family photograph, now seemed tainted by dishonesty. As the months passed, a new equilibrium slowly emerged within the royal family. William took a more prominent role, his moral authority strengthened by his dignified handling of the crisis. He implemented new financial transparency measures and insisted on regular audits of all royal finances. The trust fund money, what could be recovered of it, was placed in a newly established foundation dedicated to causes Diana had championed. It was a fitting tribute to his mother's memory and a clear repudiation of those who had tried to subvert her wishes. The relationship between William and Camilla never recovered. While they maintained a civil facade for official functions, the warmth that had slowly developed over the years was gone, replaced by a cold formality. William was scrupulously polite, never giving the media additional fodder, but everyone could see that the stepmother-stepson relationship was now purely ceremonial. Family gatherings became exercises in careful choreography, ensuring that interactions were minimized while maintaining appearances. Charles, caught in the middle, aged visibly under the strain. His attempts to mediate were rebuffed by both sides. William made it clear that while he would always respect his father's position, he could never forget or forgive what had been done. The future of the monarchy itself seemed to hang in the balance, with many questioning whether the institution could survive such a fundamental breach of trust. Constitutional experts debated whether Camilla could remain as queen consort when the time came. Given the circumstances, public sentiment was overwhelmingly on William's side. Diana's memory still commanded fierce loyalty, and the idea that her final wishes had been subverted struck a chord with people around the world. Demonstrations outside royal residences became common, with protesters demanding justice and accountability. The Republican movement, always present but usually marginal in British politics, gained new momentum. If the royals could betray each other so fundamentally, many asked, what moral authority did they have to reign? But William understood something that many missed. The monarchy's survival didn't depend on the perfection of its members but on their ability to acknowledge fault and reform. He began a series of unprecedented changes, opening up royal finances to public scrutiny, and establishing new governance structures that would prevent such deceptions in the future. He met with Diana's family and friends, assuring them that her legacy would be protected. These actions, more than any words, began to restore public faith. The final act of this drama came at an unexpected moment. During a state banquet for a visiting head of state, Camilla rose to make what everyone assumed would be routine remarks. Instead, she delivered a public apology that stunned even seasoned royal watchers. She acknowledged her actions, expressed deep remorse, and announced that she would be stepping back from all public duties indefinitely. It was a moment of genuine emotion from a woman who had always been controlled in public, and it marked the end of her active role in royal life. William's reaction to this apology was watched by millions around the world. He listened impassively, his face giving nothing away. When Camilla finished speaking, he rose from his seat and gave a brief nod of acknowledgement. He didn't speak, didn't offer forgiveness or condemnation. His silence was more powerful than any words could have been. It spoke of wounds too deep for simple apologies, of trust too shattered to be easily rebuilt. But it also spoke of a man who had chosen dignity over revenge. In the years that followed, this scandal became a defining moment in the modern monarchy. William's handling of the crisis became a template for royal behavior in the face of personal betrayal and public scrutiny. He had shown that it was possible to be both human and regal, to acknowledge pain while maintaining dignity. The reforms he implemented transformed the monarchy into a more transparent and accountable institution, ultimately strengthening its position in British society. The story of Camilla's deception and William's reaction became a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of power and the importance of truth. It showed that even within the most privileged circles, actions have consequences, and that public trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. But it also demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit and the power of dignified response in the face of betrayal. William emerged from the crisis not diminished but strengthened, a future king who had been tested by fire and had not been found wanting. As for Camilla, she retreated into a kind of internal exile. Still technically a member of the royal family, she became a ghost-like presence, seen but not heard, present but not participating. Her story became a tragedy of her own making, a woman who had achieved everything she had sought but lost it through her own actions. The young woman who had once captured a prince's heart ended her days in isolation, a reminder that some victories come at too high a price. The impact on William's children was carefully managed. He and Catherine worked hard to shield them from the worst of the scandal while also teaching them important lessons about integrity and trust. They grew up understanding that privilege came with responsibility, and that their actions would always be subject to scrutiny. The crisis that could have destroyed their faith in family instead became a teaching moment about the importance of honesty and the consequences of deception. Harry's relationship with the royal family, already strained, took on new dimensions after these revelations. While he and William found common cause in their anger over the betrayal, it also reinforced Harry's decision to step away from royal life. He saw in Camilla's actions a confirmation of his worst fears about the institution, its capacity for manipulation and its willingness to sacrifice individuals for its own preservation. The scandal became part of his narrative about why he had chosen a different path. The financial reforms that William implemented in the wake of the scandal transformed how the monarchy operated. Independent auditors were brought in, charitable foundations were restructured, and new safeguards were put in place to prevent any individual from having too much control over royal finances. These changes, initially resisted by traditionalists within the palace, ultimately modernized the institution and made it more resilient to future scandals. In the end, the story of Camilla's deception and William's stunning reaction became more than just a royal scandal. It became a defining moment in the evolution of the British monarchy, a painful but necessary reckoning with past mistakes and future responsibilities. William's dignified response set a new standard for royal behavior, showing that true nobility came not from titles or wealth but from character and integrity. The monarchy emerged from the crisis changed but not broken, scarred but stronger, ready to face the challenges of a new era with hard-won wisdom.